Modernism and Fiction, James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. On or about December 1910, human nature changed. The great modernist writer Virginia Woolf wrote this in her essay, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, in 1924. All human relations shifted, and when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. She was, of course, being facetious in her dating of the change to a particular month and year, though that was the month of a major art exhibition in London. But the changes in European society and in British literature are undeniable. She was pointing to the arrival of the modern period. Now, modern here doesn't mean now, right? It doesn't mean up to date. Modernism is the name of a literary period lasting from the early 20th century until 1939. So some modernist tendencies are evident as early as 1890, and so some people push that for opening date back. But the end date is usually set at 1939. That's the beginning of World War II, but it's also the year of the publication of James Joyce's modernist novel, Finnegan's Wake. Now, the modern period is characterized by a sense of chaotic instability resulting from the loss of previous stabilizing cultural forces. There was the loss of religious faith. Obviously, this has its roots in the Victorian unsettlement of faith, but it's much more complete and more serious now. There was a loss of faith in collective values, especially after World War I. These great Western European values had failed to prevent a devastating, inhumane war. Can we rely on them anymore? Can we believe in them? Further, there was a loss of faith in rationality. People came to believe that there was no real access to truth, only differing human perspectives. And those perspectives are influenced by all sorts of things that are irrational. Your personal experience, your emotions, your psychological needs will alter your thinking. Rationality doesn't give us access to truth. And finally, and very disturbingly, the loss of a coherent sense of individual identity. And several thinkers of the time contributed to this feeling that there wasn't a unified self. Sigmund Freud wrote about the conflicting parts of the human psyche and insisted that our actions were driven not by our will and our conscious mind, but by unconscious motives and desires. Marx said our values are only our values because of our class status and the interests of our class. Your values are not the values of your family or the values of some personal identity. They're simply the values of your class. Literary modernism expresses this sense of chaotic instability. One way is through fragmentation. So T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, if you've had a chance to read that, is sort of a prime site for this kind of fragmentation, or even James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. They also see themselves, the literary modernists, as rejecting old traditions in literature. So Ezra Pound urged his fellow modernists to make it new, and they did, experimenting with new styles and new forms. Fiction writers embrace perspectivalism. That is the idea that there's no one reliable truth about something, only multiple perspectives that people have about it. So in fiction, this means the rejection of an omniscient narrator. There's no such perspective that gives you the truth about a story. There's no God's eye view. Instead, you have unreliable narrators or stories written from a particular character's point of view using the stream of consciousness technique. Finally, modernist writers gave up trying to speak to the society at large, as many Victorian writers hoped to do. The modernists wrote self-consciously for an elite audience who could understand their experimental fiction and poetry. Now we're going to look at two works of modernist fiction. The first, Araby, is by Irish writer James Joyce, who lived from 1882 to 1941. His major works were one collection of short stories and three novels. Dubliners, which he wrote in 1914 and from which Araby comes, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man in 1916, Ulysses in 1922, and finally Finnegan's Wake in 1939. So the work you're going to read is from that earliest work, Dubliners, and it doesn't really represent the kind of writing that made James Joyce famous. His exploration of the technique of stream of consciousness. So I wanted to show you a little sample of what did make him famous. This is the opening of his second major work, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, and this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nice little boy named Baby Tuckoo. His father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. He was Baby Tuckoo. The moo cow came down the road where Betty Byrne lived. She sold lemon flat. Oh, the wild rose blossoms on the little green place. He sang that song. That was his song. Oh, the green wolf blossoms. When you wet the bed, first it is warm, then it gets cold. His mother put on the oil sheet. That had the queer smell. Okay, here is the world seen through the eyes of a young boy, Stephen Dedalus. In the novel, as he grows, the sophistication of his consciousness and understanding of the world increases, but he's never really a wholly reliable narrator. This is more the kind of work that made James Joyce famous. Dubliners, while less experimental, is still a fascinating work. It's a short story collection where all the stories are set in Dublin. So together they create a portrait of the city. Joyce said he chose Dublin as the setting for Dubliners because for him the city seemed to be the center of paralysis. And when you're reading the opening paragraphs of Araby, look for that. Look for the descriptions that express that kind of paralysis. They also, the stories in Dubliners, introduce an important technique in the 20th century short story, the epiphany, which Joyce himself invented. Now, epiphany had a traditional meaning. Epiphany is the Christian holiday celebrating the coming of the Magi, the manifestation of the divine nature of Jesus to the Gentiles, as represented when the wise men come and see in this ordinary baby God, Jesus the Christ. Right? A Joycean epiphany, so Joyce took this term and applied it to something in literature. And it's a character's sudden revelation of truth or self-discovery just coming out of ordinary experience in ordinary life. So that's the similarity, right? It's an ordinary baby and suddenly you understand something about God. Right? It's an ordinary day, it's an ordinary experience, and suddenly you have this revelation of truth about the world or about yourself. The second short story you're going to read is Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street by Virginia Woolf, who lived from 1882 to 1941. Her major works are Mrs. Dalloway in 1925, To the Lighthouse in 1927, Orlando in 1928, all of those are novels, and then a long essay, A Room of One's Own, which she published in 1929, and you're going to read part of that essay. The story itself, Mrs. Dalloway on Bond Street in 1923, was one of two short stories that contributed to the great novel Mrs. Dalloway. It was published in 1823 in the magazine The Dial. It is written entirely in stream of consciousness. So, stream of consciousness, which we also saw in Joyce, is really a new way of representing consciousness. In earlier literature, characters' thoughts might be narrated by an omniscient narrator who could see what he or she was thinking, Or you might be able to follow a character's train of thought through interior monologue. But stream of consciousness represents thought as much less governed by reason and logical connections. Instead, thoughts are influenced by all sorts of things, external stimuli, right? As Mrs. Dalloway walks through London, she's bombarded by visual and auditory imagery, and that changes her thinking. It changes what she's thinking about. There are also internal stimuli. So have you ever been trying to follow a lecture in class, but you're hungry, and so you keep thinking about food instead of literature, right? That's an internal stimulus that's changing your train of thought, changing the way you're thinking. There are memories that come to you and change your thinking. You might smell some frying food, and that reminds you of funnel cakes, and suddenly there are memories of the state fair that come flooding back. You weren't thinking about the state fair. You didn't intend to think about the state fair. It's not relevant to what you were thinking about, but now you are. Right? And that kind of thing keeps happening in Mrs. Dalloway. And finally, there are things that you're worried about or obsessed with. Maybe your mother is being tested for cancer and you're worried about the results, and you find yourself thinking about it while you're trying to write a paper, right? Or while you're trying to have a conversation with your roommate. And that happens to Mrs. Dalloway too. There are things she's worried about, things she's thinking about that keep coming back. So as you read, be aware of all these things influencing Mrs. Dalloway's thoughts. There's almost no plot in Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street. Mrs. Dalloway walks through London to buy a pair of gloves, and she gets to the store and she decides on a pair, and then a car backfires. So the interest and unity come from the development of character, right? We see her from the inside, and also from themes that recur throughout the story. So as you read, you want to look for recurring themes. Here are a few of them, but you may find others. One theme is time, the passing of time, aging. Mrs. Dalloway is 52 and getting older, aware of her own aging. There's memory. And the way memory affects her being in the world. There's mortality. There's a lot about death and a kind of obsession with death. So look for moments when that obsession with death affects her thinking. And finally, this is set in London right after the First World War. The effects of the First World War on London, the way that it's changed London society.